Now we're going into energy policy and how we can translate energy targets into policy. We've got three very esteemed speakers joining us for this panel, but first we're going to introduce the topic with a short video. We'll be right back.
In 2021, almost 22% of the energy consumed in the EU came from renewable resources. The EU originally planned to increase this to 32% by 2030. Spurred by the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis, a new ambitious target of 42.5% has now been set. But are these new targets ambitious enough? How can these targets be effectively translated into policies? Which countries are already on track and which are not? Find out this and more from the experts in our next panel discussion, From Energy Targets to Policy.
So we are now talking from energy targets to policy. We're going to be talking about, are we on track? Are we ambitious enough? Or should European countries' goals be more harmonized? To discuss these issues and more, we've got Dr. Simon Evans, Deputy Editor and Senior Policy Editor at Carbon Brief. Before his position at Carbon Brief, Dr. Evans worked for the environmental journal The Ends report for 6 years, covering topics including climate science and air pollution. He holds a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Bristol and previously studied chemistry at the University of Oxford. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. And joining him, we have Michaela Holl, who is a Senior Associate at Agora Energiewende. In her position there, Michaela worked on topics related to the Green Deal, green recovery and green finance. She was an official at the European Commission for 16 years and is responsible for renewable energy financing, energy infrastructure, the clean energy package, and energy efficiency in buildings. Michaela, it's a pleasure to have you joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Good to hear. And finally, we have Marie-Claire Brisbois, Senior Lecturer at the University of Sussex. She is a co-investigator in the governance theme for the UK Energy Demand Research Centre, and her work examines questions of power, politics, and influence in energy, water, and climate governance contexts. Marie-Claire, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Great. So let's dive straight into the topic at hand. Michaela, what is the difference between energy targets and energy policy?
Political reality, I guess one could say, right? We saw in the introductory images or the video that came before you started speaking, the renewables target of the new one of 42.5, which is in reality very ambitious because it basically means we have to build as much renewables this decade as we did in 2 decades before, right? But yeah, indeed, as I said, I think with targets, especially at EU level, you have to really look what's behind. Now I will be revealing my age here, but I still remember working in the Commission circa 2000, where we had the Lisbon strategy. And there the target was to become the most competitive knowledge-based economy by 2010, right? And I mean, if you look back, so that was maybe a target that wasn't underpinned. When it comes to the EU climate policies, I think what we have seen under the Green Deal was the new climate law that effectively binds all EU institutions and its member states to net zero and to minus 55 net domestically by 2030. That is a quantum leap that we have done. So this is really a big thing. And equally also the binding share for renewables. I think with hindsight, you could say that having had this target pulled in the renewables, it also helped us in the energy crisis. What I see, however, more difficult, and I want to take the example of the discussion at EU level, which was also monitored a lot in Germany, on the combustion engine phase out. And basically, I see it's much more difficult to agree on stopping certain activities. Like, we ended up with a compromise that still contains a loophole and investment certainty. So that, I think, is a bit the next step of the story, where you really hit political reality. And with this, I stop. I hope I wasn't too long.
No, not at all. Thank you. I think there's a lot of things that you mentioned there that we can definitely unpack a little bit more and bring in later in the discussion. But first, Marie-Claire, what are the challenges of translating targets into policy, building on what Michaela just said, and then into concrete action?
Yeah, I think Michaela alluded to it there, where she said that then you hit political reality, because when you're trying to translate the targets into policy, it really becomes a game of politics. So you have different actors with different relative levels of influence who would like to see targets developed in a different way or met in different ways. And it becomes a game of interest group politics. And then the policies that you do see come out of that will suit the context and political priorities at that time. But then the next stage, when you do arrive at those policies, is implementation. And this one is particularly difficult in the climate context because we're trying to move so quickly. So we have this pressure around speed, and there are material challenges to meeting these targets. So we have existing physical infrastructure. There are buildings, there are factories, there are plants, there are appliances, these things that take time to replace and take a lot of money. So there's a lot of sunk investment. So it can be difficult for that reason. There's also obviously always economic impacts from the transition, and there's lots of effort to try to ease those economic impacts or to develop alternate revenues. But when you're trying to implement the policies, you want to ease the economic shocks in any sector, whether it's for companies or for populations. And finally, a lot of the change that were required is very much decisions that people and businesses need to make, and their behavior changes. And we're social animals, and it takes time for us to make behavior changes, and we need to have the space and be supported in doing that. So yeah, there are all these challenges to effective implementation, and all of them need to be handled and taken seriously, but it's really just a lot of work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marie-Claire. And Simon, maybe looking at a more UK perspective, do you think the repercussions of not following targets are strict enough? And can you give any examples?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the UK was something of a front runner in terms of the Climate Change Act and the framework that set out for having not only a long-term target, so the 2050 target to cut emissions by 80%, and that obviously got later upgraded to 100%, a net zero target, but also to have the interim carbon budgets for each 5-year period all the way out to 2050. And I think that's seen by some people as having been a kind of an influence, a precursor, if you like, of the Paris Agreement's nationally determined contributions, which are ratcheted up over time. And so at the moment we have NDCs covering the period to 2030, and in 2025 we'll get another set covering the period to 2035. But I mean, one of the things that's actually less perhaps well appreciated about the Climate Change Act is that although it was groundbreaking in many ways, and it has set out this very clear kind of political framework for target setting and putting policies in place to actually meet those targets, it doesn't actually have many teeth. And I guess we could easily say the same about the Paris Agreement. So the UK, there aren't, if the UK comes back at the end of a carbon budget period So, like the 2018 to 2022, I think it's the most recent carbon budget. And I think the UK is expected to have easily met that because of economic shocks like COVID, pandemic, and so on. But had the UK not met that target, then all of the consequences are quite limited. So the Secretary of State would have had to stand up in Parliament and say, "Sorry, guys, we didn't meet the target." And then they would have to set out policies to show how they would make up the difference. But that's really it. There's no kind of court case. There's no trial. There's no, external actors can take the government to court and, have a judicial review against the government. And we've seen that happen. The High Court ruling last year showing that the government's plans and policies weren't in line with the carbon budgets. But beyond that, there's quite limited recourse if the UK isn't on track, and obviously at a global level in terms of the Paris Agreement, that's an even bigger issue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Simon. And Michaela, looking a little bit more in the EU context, you mentioned before that obviously the 42.5% renewable energy target is very ambitious. How do you find translating this overarching policy into more specific country policy? And, does it need to be really tailored to each country? And how is this kind of being done across the board, do you find?
Are you talking now specifically about the renewables target or at Green Deal in general?
It's Green Deal in general.
Okay, so how it is translated? Well, this Green Deal program that started in 2019 was really, in a way, big. Like green as our new growth story, it was big. And from the start, it was clear that in order for everyone to come along, you needed to make concessions. And indeed, it's true that in many of the files were discussed and negotiated and concluded rather quickly. And it's really, there were so many of them open at the same time. So basically, what happened a lot of time that you had a lot of exemptions for certain countries' position, right? So it started with discussions under I remember in the recovery program, which was basically giving money to green investment needs, right? So it was the Green Deal started, and then after the crisis, we had this recovery money, a lot of new money, which for the first time gave actually a big chunk of new money for green investment, right? And there, for example, you had to allow for certain gas investments in some countries under certain conditions to take everyone along. And I already alluded to the cost discussion. So in a way, yeah, like, for example, to conclude with the Renewables Directive, which was the starting point in your question, like, for example, there we still drag along this legacy bioenergy in a way that is supported by many countries and, which is not the sustainable way to grow in some aspects, but you had to in order to get a deal. So it's always difficult. There are 27 member states around the table, right? But I think it set the general direction of travel. And to conclude, maybe, as I just said, there was really an enormous amount. I think we first have to take stock at some point. I mean, we had another agreement tonight on the methane. So the first rules on methane emissions, including imports, which is big, but it's just hard to keep up with everything. We will have to take stock at the end, next year. So what did the Green Deal? Where are the gaps? Where are the inconsistencies? Which will be a big job. But I think that's how it is here. Is the reality. I mean, you see how difficult it is to manage 16 Länder in Germany. So it's not more easy in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of complexities involved. And Marie-Claire, do you think we need more harmonization of policies across Europe and specifically between mainland Europe and the UK?
Yeah, it's a good question. In some instances, it would be nice if the UK would follow Europe on some things, but that's another conversation. But I think the answer to this is actually quite complicated. we're just wrapping up a big 4-year project looking on transitions in cold regions called Sintran. And in that project, we looked at how the transitions are happening in different regions, and looked at the social and demographic data, and really the places that are having an easier time transitioning are places, perhaps logically, that have greater levels of economic diversification, stronger economies, stronger social fabrics, and other places are really struggling, and that's even with just transition funds. And so to have harmonized policies and approaches sounds nice, but there are places that need more support than other places. They're starting from a different baseline. So while targets need to be ambitious, and there really needs to be a push to do things faster. And there's actually research that's just come out recently from my colleague Jessica Jewell, talking about how things aren't moving fast enough. And this is maybe also not surprising. We need to be moving faster. But especially in electricity markets, we're basically following what would be expected without all the extra push from the targets. So we need to be more ambitious, but we need to be thinking through how this happens in different places, and looking not just at sort of the usual suspects, so that the workers in the industries who are directly affected, because those people actually have quite strong voices in these processes. They're heard. We pay attention to unions and we pay attention to companies, but the other people in these regions, also the ones who we need to be taking up behavior changes and providing social support, not pushing back politically or socially. These are populations that really need a lot more attention and need to be included much more. And so that's difficult with a fully harmonized approach. So I do think we do need to be careful, and to pay attention to where there are and where we need contextual differences.
Very comprehensive answer. Thank you, Marie-Claire. And Simon, what do you think are the repercussions of UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's delay on net zero targets? So specifically pushing back the ban on sales of fossil fuel cars, fossil fuel heating devices, and scrapping minimum energy efficiency requirements.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about the speech that Rishi Sunak gave and the details of the policies that came out subsequently is that there was a little bit of a disconnect actually between the way it was sold to the media. So obviously it was briefed to the papers, beforehand, and the rhetoric and the kind of message that he seemed to be trying to send was, guys, we're going slow on net zero targets because they're unaffordable, unachievable, not realistic. Haven't been thought through carefully, and we're being careful and thinking them through and doing it in a way that families can cope with, and that was very much the sort of political messaging. But in fact, the changes that were made were much more minor than you might have imagined if you just listened to the speech. So for example, on the phase out of combustion engine cars, it had been, the target had been that from 2030 you wouldn't be able to buy a new combustion engine car, but you would still be able to buy a hybrid combustion engine car. And the change was simply to say, okay, you can buy a hybrid combustion engine car or just a pure combustion engine car. So in fact, if you once people started to do the numbers on these changes, they were relatively minimal on paper. But then I guess what this really, in terms of what are the implications of the speech, I think this really speaks to the fact that, a lot of this stuff around how we translate targets into action on the ground and how we bring people along with the transition, is that actually politics and messaging actually really does matter. And so the signals that Rishi Sunak was deliberately sending to the population of the UK, to companies considering investments in the country, those signals will have an influence. And even if the changes on paper are relatively minimal, it's almost I think it's pretty widely accepted now that the change in approach, the change in rhetoric, will make it harder for the UK to meet its targets.
You bring about a really interesting topic there of the role of the media in this entire process of policy and the way that we view different policies as well, which might shape how it's developed in the future. What do you think could have been better about the coverage to maybe have communicated that more clearly, or what do you think is really important for the media to keep in mind for these messages about energy policy?
I mean, I think, it's very common now for governments and other organizations to very heavily control the media messaging, and they do that in a variety of ways. One of the tactics that the UK government likes to employ, and I don't think they're unique in this, is that they would put out a very short kind of press release at kind of late in the day, with an embargo for the next morning, right? So all of the newspapers, it's a big announcement, they want to cover it, but all they've got to go on is this very short briefing, and maybe they can talk to they talk to insiders, they get they can quote people and so on, but the information they have available is very limited, and only after only much later do the actual details get published. Now, so that that puts the media in a very difficult position. But obviously, and there's not a lot that people can do about that apart from complain. The media have to all cover it, because otherwise their competitors will scoop them. But I guess one of the things, specifically in relation to Rishi Sunak's speech, was that he said, we remain committed to all of our targets on climate change, and virtually none of the mainstream media coverage asked him to give details on exactly how they intended to still meet their targets despite the changes that they announced. And I think part of that is down to just the lack of time that I already mentioned, and part of that is down to again, another sort of media control tactic is to give stories to political journalists. I mean, it's a big political story, but actually it's it's a climate story, it's an energy story. But the story went not to the energy and climate specialists at newspapers and TV studios, but to the political journalists. And they for all of their skills, they're not specialists, and they don't have the information, the knowledge to ask those difficult questions. Again, it's very difficult for media organizations to fight back against these methods, but there was a clear gap there in terms of the coverage.
Thanks, Simon. And something that has been appearing in the media in Germany a lot in the last few years is the smart meter rollout. Michaela, do you think Germany's slow smart meter rollout can be partly attributed to ineffective policy?
Well, I think Germany, generally speaking, when it comes to digital innovation, is a little bit of a special case, right? I guess it just fits the overall pattern. I mean, you asked me before about should we harmonize more, and the smart meter rules from the internal energy market rules is a perfect example, where basically the member states were given rather big freedom, and then Germany implemented it in a more limited way, only not for the private households and rather late. And in other countries, they implemented it differently. And then have by now more awareness on the household side on the effect of renewables, for example, which would be helpful in, taking people along. And then on the other hand, the fact that Germany waited longer means that now they can jump on the, in the second generation of smart meter devices also. I mean, because we see in some countries they swap now. So, okay. Generally this was, if you look now at what you need in terms of flexibility, what they're also discussing in the current and the electricity market design, obviously you should have gone ahead. But I think at the time when the smart meter obligation was announced a few years back, we were also in a different we were still in a different world, I think, in in what you need to manage a modern energy system. So I would hope it goes a bit faster now.
And speaking of being in a different world, obviously the energy transition is changing so much in the energy market. So there's going to constantly be something new. Do you think policymakers and authorities need to be looking more ahead to be able to predict these things that are coming so that we can create effective policy now that enables those future energy systems?
Is this again for me?
Yeah.
I mean, it's super difficult, this uncertainty question. So we already heard from Marie, we have to go super fast. And that's true. And then at the same time, you don't know anything. And like I spent a lot of time working on hydrogen, which was a bit of a hype here, at least in Brussels, and I guess also in other places over the past few years, right? And you have this constant difficulty that, certain people want to go ahead very quickly without not many rules, but it's really difficult to say how the future looks like. You kind of know the future will be very different when it comes to hydrogen because, while some people want to push this idea of it can replace one by one the way we use gas, but that's not at all the case. So basically it's very difficult, and that's what we're at the moment discussing. You see this conflict, like it's difficult to design a framework for an unknown future. Yeah, very difficult. I guess the only way would be to constantly react, to build in continuous revisions maybe also. But it's difficult. Yeah, I don't know what the others say.
Marie-Claire, maybe in line with this, you have a bit of experience with energy ownership and how that is disrupting political power relationships in the energy sector. Could you shed a little bit of light on that?
Sure. It is. I mean, the extent to which it's functionally disrupting political power relationships is still quite small, but we have been seeing emerging changes. To Michaela's point about how everything is changing, this is something that there's been a lot of thinking about on the part of, a lot of retired power systems engineers talking about decentralization and people wanting to own their own energy generation sources, not just having centralized infrastructure, because renewables, we need a lot more of them. We need them spread out everywhere, essentially. So there has been this push, but it's very different from how we've done things in the past. In Europe, we're used, at least in modern times, to centralized, largely top-down energy generation and distribution. So as it's become easier to own solar panels or put up wind turbines, although that's a bit more difficult, there's this interest in ownership, in shifting from just big corporate owners. And we've seen progress. The fact that within the clean energy package, there are provisions for energy communities, so people to share ownership of energy resources, is a sign that there are political inroads happening. And this is progressively building. So in Germany, we've seen that renewable energy communities collectively there have had a big impact on the climate accord from 2018 or 2019. And we see also in Germany, where there's quite a lot of distributed ownership, that these groups are invited to talk about issues with the energy system and with networks. So that's a big shift. It's bringing new voices into energy systems, and they're voices that aren't necessarily purely focused on generation of profit. They're interested in a much wider suite of issues, which is very different. So having a not-for-profit focus means you participate in conversations about energy markets, in conversations about how climate plans should look very, very differently. At the same time, it would be naive to say that this is not a contested space, because there's a lot of money to be made in energy generation, and there's quite a lot of pushback. So in the UK, we saw a feed-in tariff program that was quite progressive a couple decades ago, but that support has been systematically removed from that because it was essentially too successful, and we've seen this in other places. disrupting the system too much, which is political, but also material. We have a different grid of infrastructure when we have a lot of people making decisions, and you need connections, and you need a lot more coordination. You need smart meters. You need to be making decisions at a much finer grained scale. But it is also political. It is also about who makes money off of energy assets, energy generation, energy distribution. And so this is a political issue that's playing out in just about every country, whether how it's framed is different in different places, but it's showing up in most parliaments.
Interesting. And just going off the topic of too much disruption, I find that really interesting. Michaela, with your experience with the European Commission, do you think did you have experience with too much disruption?
Okay, you went off script also here, and you're catching me with a difficult question. Yeah, I mean, I explained already that the Commission has always to have a look at what the 27 want, and amongst them in particular the big ones, right? I mean, that's basically the mandate that you have, the limits within which you operate. You see, like, one example I have, I mean, we talk about energy and all the difficulties, but if you look at agriculture, which is a big issue within the EU budget, right? I mean, like here, the Commission really, I mean, I remember the budget proposals where we tried to shift like 6-7 years back into more the investment needs of the future, and it was pushed back. And any attempt to go back there and reform the common agriculture policy, you know, to move towards, you know, that you're only rewarded for nature service and not for size, has so far been very, very difficult for the Commission. So it's difficult to do revolution. And then basically what we see is we move ahead, we jump when there's a big crisis moment, no? Like, for example, this having coming debt, having this big new budget for green and digital that we had with the recovery that was born out of the COVID crisis. So that's when we make a jump. So you need, well, we had a lot of crisis, so that should help. But you see, the space in which you operate is very clearly defined and is not conducive to systemic change and revolution. Maybe you have to deal with what you have.
Very nice, thank you, Michaela. And Simon, continuing this discussion about innovation and policy and the energy transition kind of changing lots of systems, do you think policy needs to be a little bit more forward-thinking to play a bigger role in driving innovation?
Yeah, before I'm happy to answer that, but just before I do, I wanted to come back on something we were talking about earlier with this idea about policy making under uncertainty. And I just thought it'd be nice to give a UK example, which I think is quite relevant here. So obviously, you know, decarbonising the way we heat buildings is a massive part of the challenge, you know, for reaching net zero, and it's kind of one of the next big frontiers. You know, we're well on the way to decarbonising electricity systems, although there's a long way to go. But you know, and EV sales are, you know, really taking off, but decarbonising buildings remains a huge challenge. And in the UK, there's long been this debate about you know, what the role is for hydrogen heating versus electrification with heat pumps. And you know, that it had been thought, oh, you know, the expert consensus is not really there. You know, there's going to be a role for different solutions in different types of property and so on. And so the government, in this situation of what it felt was this kind of expert uncertainty, basically just punted the decision, and it just said, okay, we're gonna think about this a lot. We're going to maybe run some trials of hydrogen heating, but we're not going to make a decision strategically on whether this is going to play a major role in decarbonising the UK's buildings until 2026. Now that they said that some years ago, and now over time, Michaela, you already alluded to this. The expert consensus has really firmed up, and now it's pretty clear that essentially all expert advice suggests that there shouldn't really be a major role for hydrogen heat because it's incredibly inefficient, and heat pumps are likely to be cheaper. Just generally much better from a thermodynamic energy systems cost perspective. And yet we're kind of locked into this deferred decision-making thing where the UK is still not committing one way or the other, and it's still got this 2026 date. And then at the same time, it comes back to one of the other things we were talking about, the kind of political interest groups and so on. And obviously, we're expecting, on current polling at least, to see a Labour government coming in after the next election. And while the current government has been kind of hardening its view against hydrogen heat, the Labour Party's really not been saying very much at all. And that comes very much down to the fact that the GMB union, which represents basically people that install gas boilers, those people are obviously, for quite obvious reasons, are not in favour of going down the heat pump route, because that effectively means their career, their job, their industry goes up in smoke. And the GMB is lobbying, as are the gas companies, the gas distribution companies, the gas boiler companies. They're all lobbying very hard to maintain this potential role for hydrogen heat, despite all of the expert evidence suggesting that that's not a good idea. And because of the fact that there's an election coming up, the government's effectively just leaving that uncertainty. So actually, this is a case of they think there's uncertainty, or it's politically convenient for the uncertainty to remain, but in fact, it should be pretty clear what they should do, and they're just not doing it for political reasons.
Simon, if I may ask, if
sure,
it's okay
yeah.
if I come in, great. I was trying to think about, in order to avoid this situation where basically we acted against expert advice, which was available, right? How could we institutionalize that the expert advice informs the political processes more, so that basically you have an independent review and the politicians don't only hear, you know how it is unbalanced, right? Certain people have a better access, and the incumbents, it's easier to defend the status quo than the new things, and right. So can you think of any way, like, how you could institutionalize this independent expert voices more in the process?
Yeah, I mean, so just to reinforce what you said about incumbents and access and so on, I mean, that's very much the situation at the moment. I didn't go myself, but the party conferences for the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in September were saw very, very heavy lobbying, lots of events paid for, organised by the gas industry, and pushing the idea of hydrogen heat. And obviously that gives them access to, not only to the policymakers themselves, but their advisors and so on. And it creates this sense that there is still a question, there's still an idea that it might be sensible to go down that route. In terms of like institutionalizing expert advice, I mean, I guess that again, that in a way, that's one of the positive aspects of the Climate Change Act, is that it created the Climate Change Committee. That is it's an independent government advisor written into statute. They have a statutory basis in law, and they any major decisions on the level of the carbon budgets and so on has to be taken in light of their advice. So heading into the next decision, the seventh carbon budget decision, which I think is probably a couple of years away still, they will produce very detailed advice on what how much the UK should reduce its emissions, and crucially how it should do that. So whereas in its previous advice for the sixth carbon budget, it was relatively equivocal, it kind of didn't come down firmly one way or the other on hydrogen heat, I suspect, from the conversations I've had with people on the committee staff, that their seventh carbon budget advice will be much more definitive. I guess the issue there is that won't happen for a couple of years. And meanwhile, there are kind of, regulated investment plans that the gas distribution network companies are going to be submitting, and potentially having signed off, major investments in continued upgrade of the gas grid, which would be totally pointless and total waste of money if we do decide not to go down the hydrogen heating route.
Also, kind of going on from this, you all come from kind of different backgrounds of think tanks, academic institutions, media outlets. How can we kind of combine forces a little bit more, pool knowledge resources and things like that to push a really effective policy forward? This is an open question. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in.
I mean, certainly from my perspective, I guess, Carbon Brief doesn't take a position on things, so we don't see our role in terms of lobbying for particular outcomes, but we do see a very clear role for ourselves in terms of highlighting what the evidence shows, and presenting it in ways that is easier to understand. So translating between researchers, scientists, and so on. And a message that is easily digestible by, whether it's by journalists to write it up into newspapers, or whether it's policymakers themselves. And I think there's often quite a big gap between the expert advice and ways that are easy to understand. So that's where we come in, I think. But yeah, keen to hear what the others think.
Yeah, Claire, did you want to add? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, because we've been doing the best we can with how we know. I mean, we know from research how to make change. We know how to work in coalitions. We know how to build movements. All of this people have studied over the years for how social change has been realized in the past around women getting the vote or civil rights. But we're trying all those things, and we're not getting where we need to get fast enough. So I think the question is, what do we need to do differently? And it's a challenge that we don't have a lot of time, both to meet the targets, but in terms of our lives, we're also busy. And we need to be doing things differently, and testing things out, and trying to build broader consensus about what are the sorts of things we want. Yes, in terms of climate policy, but also the world we want to live in moving forward, because that's really what helps to mobilize public opinion and build support for different policies. So it's not really a clear answer, except that I think we need to sort of slow down and take a breath, even while we're under this time pressure, to figure out what are the ways that we need to be working across different parts of society to come to some sort of decision about where we're going to go.
Nice, thanks. Michaela, anything to add?
Not much, but yeah, basically what we have taken here, like as for our own work, like when we witnessed, I mean, Simon was just telling a lot about the heating discussion in UK. We were probably closer to the heating discussion in Germany, where basically we realized it's not enough to present your technocratic net zero models and basically say, okay, that's what we have to do. We need X million cars electric on the road, and and so on, so many heat pumps, but that this distributional impact story, and that you also have to basically deliver with this scenario a way to make it happen, and to determine what the investment needs are, that has to be wrapped up a lot. So that's basically what we took for us as guidance for the future in a way.
Nice, thank you. And we just have a question from the audience. It'll be our last question, as we're almost out of time. Michaela, I'll direct this to you. In your opinion, which EU country or countries are currently on track to meet the EU Green Deal's targets? Big question there.
Okay, well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Looking back at 2020, we saw we kind of made it for, we have 3 targets: emission reduction, renewables, and energy efficiency. What's really lagging is the reduction of energy demand. Yeah, we kind of jumped over this, just also helped by, COVID. Let's be And even after the energy shock from the Ukraine invasion, we saw substantial reductions, more than we thought what was possible, but that we don't still see this structural demand reduction be high enough. I don't think that any country is on a track on delivering that bit of the story. And when it comes to renewables, the only thing I realized, because when I still was working on renewables on the Commission, we always knew kind of where the countries were. It's amazing how you can also jump ahead in a few years in renewables, because they are just so cheap. Like I remember the Netherlands always lagging behind, and now all of a sudden they are like, wow, they are doing really great, right? So I mean, with emissions, we are kind of on track if you don't add the story that much of our carbon imprint is also outsourced outside Europe, right? But so I hope this kind of gives an answer. Maybe Simon, you want to add on this not so scientific general overview?
I mean, yeah, don't really have all that much to add, but you know, I mean, one of the reflections I was thinking about earlier, you know, you're talking about these 3 different targets that the EU had, and obviously they've become more specific, more binding within the Green Deal package for 2030 compared to the 2020 package. And it was sort of interesting to reflect on the fact that the UK, obviously within the EU before leaving, was always heavily opposed to those kind of sectoral or specific targets.
I remember that. Yeah.
And you talked also about the Commission, you know, having to triangulate between the, you know, priorities of different member states. So I'm sure that must have been super challenging to navigate. And obviously, you know, now the UK is outside, and we've seen that I guess perhaps more German approach to target setting being more kind of heavily embedded. But you know, arguably that's you know a big part of the success of progress in the EU, kind of in the broad sweep of things, has been those sectoral targets driving change in a way that wouldn't have happened with a sort of heavier focus on the emissions trading system on its own, for example, which would have been more towards the UK's priorities. So I think in a way that target setting has been vindicated.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We're already a little bit over, but super interesting discussion. Thank you so much for all of your insights. Simon, Michaela and Marie-Claire, really interesting. Thank you and have a great day.